Hi, my name is Nejra van Zalk. I am a lecturer in psychology and human factors at Imperial College London. Now, data harms as a concept include everything from harms as a result of someone's data being breached to their privacy being violated. And the two are different in that privacy violations don't necessarily involve data itself being violated, but rather involve data being collected without people's knowledge. And my own research is particularly in privacy related harms, which this talk will focus on. Now, privacy is a very multifaceted construct, and it's received an ample amount of attention from psychologists, especially during the past few decades, with advances in concepts of privacy in various domains, for example, digital privacy. In a classical sense, a breach of privacy can entail things like someone reading through your post or peering into your living room window. Many of us squirm when we consider such examples, as they're very palpable and visceral. And you might have had instances of similar privacy breaches in your own life when growing up. For example, your sibling reading your innermost thoughts from your diary, or your parents finding out about someone you have feelings for, which would likely lead to some embarrassment and some emotional pain. And though such examples of breach privacy can seem pretty straightforward, we find ourselves living in a world where notions of physical and digital privacy are increasingly blurred, and perhaps to a greater degree than most people are aware. When I talk to people about their everyday experiences of digital privacy violations, most people can give me examples such as signing off on extremely lengthy terms and conditions when downloading software without reading them, and then finding themselves in positions afterwards where they felt that their privacy was compromised. Another issue is that increasingly all technologies today are connected or interconnected. They could be connected back to the company or to other devices. Everything from smart fridges to smart hairbrushes. So all technologies are increasingly becoming so-called Internet of Things devices, and they are everywhere. And they are continuously blurring this line between digital and analog. So although this fact in itself can be source of alarm, considering lack of legislation on how data from such devices is necessarily processed or used, one increasingly problematic development that is yet to receive focus is affective or empathic media. And this development falls into the field of affective computing, sometimes referred to as emotion AI. This is an interdisciplinary field of scientific and technological innovation that enables systems to classify, process, and replicate human emotions. And this kind of research uses findings from psychology, computer science, and cognitive science to derive information about how someone is feeling while they're using their devices. And these can be everything from smartphones and wearable devices such as watches, many of which now have capabilities of collecting increasingly precise physiological data or biometrics, um, but also include people's behaviors while using their laptops, for example, their clicks on websites, how long they viewed a certain ad, etc. So tech companies are investing large amounts of money into affective technologies, and these are able to derive personal and, dare I say, intimate information about individuals. So although there's still lots of debate among scholars as to the ability and efficacy of these systems to truly understand how someone is feeling, this argument is somewhat moot when we consider the amount of data available to technology companies from which they derive affective predictions. If data can be used to predict the emotions of someone typing in searches in their web browser, and the system makes a correct prediction, in only 3% of cases, this still constitutes a large number of individuals who are online at one single point in time. It can thereby be manipulated on an emotional level. So, with emotion AI systems becoming increasingly better at making such predictions, there is reason for concern. These technologies not only have potential for massive surveillance, but there are also concerns about more subtle uses, such as increasingly sophisticated emotion-based advertising and behavioral nudging. So there are negative effects that data harms can have on people's well-being without necessarily being well known or well understood. Now, as a psychologist, I'm concerned about the impact on human autonomy development from these kinds of technologies. In psychology, autonomy is an umbrella term with many different definitions, but it tends to refer to the state of independence and self-determination in an individual or a group or even a whole society. And in developmental psychology, we often talk about autonomy as the individual capacity to make an informed, uncoerced decision. And this develops throughout childhood and increases in adolescence and early adulthood. And children who derive autonomy become capable of becoming more self-reliant and start to make increasingly more independent decisions. Whereas adolescent autonomy is more closely related to things like search for identity. But overall, scholars believe that developing a healthy sense of autonomy is one of the most important developmental tasks throughout childhood and adolescence. Now, interestingly, this is often done by figuring out what works well and what doesn't. So, what I mean by that is that we tend to try things we like as well as things we don't. And through this trial and error, we move to become increasingly more sovereign. And according to Jean Piaget, who's arguably the father of modern developmental science, autonomy is born out of and results from free decision making. And the very term autonomous can explain ideas about norms, rules, and development of morals. So Piaget, for example, believed that by choosing which rules to follow and which to ignore, we are helping to determine our own behavior. Now, what happens if we're increasingly living in a world that makes our decisions for us very subtly? What happens when algorithms decide what information is shown to us, what our likes and dislikes might be? And importantly, what happens when algorithms are increasingly capable of nudging us into various experiences? One instance of this is indeed well-being. Well-being is something that as a society and as individuals we're continuously striving for, but human beings cannot always only feel good. But if I'm using systems which are capable of sensing that I'm becoming increasingly anxious, for instance, they become capable in nudging me to make certain decisions and then go back to my state of well-being again. This could be positive things like asking me to meditate if I'm feeling stressed, but increasingly it's things like purchase offers that are tailored specifically to me. So if I stretch this really far to a sort of dystopian point, in a world that is far more sinister than the one we live in now, we are all continuously nudged into some kind of emotional equilibrium that's akin to being numb by technologies that focus on increased consumerism. Although this sounds very much like something out of a Hollywood blockbuster film, I do believe that we might be heading that way unless we start making more informed decisions about legislation against such developments, but also about the design of these types of technologies in the first place. Now, this is where my own work comes in. I am based at the Design Engineering Department at Imperial College London, and I am championing something that I call design psychology there. This is a new research area that focuses on understanding psychological mechanisms that govern human behavior, our emotions, and decision-making processes that are related to designing products, services, and behavioral interventions that benefit mental health. Now, the focus here is on the benefit of mental health. As a psychologist who studied the effects of digital technologies on young people's mental health before veering off into this design psychology route, it became increasingly important for me to understand what is it about technologies in question that can impact mental health. And this is both positively and negatively. And my overarching aim with design psychology is to help develop an evidence-based and rigorously tested framework for mental health proofing digital technologies via the design psychology subdiscipline. So I am currently working with people to try and make this happen. I conduct research on these types of processes. I am teaching this to engineering students. I've created a module called Design Psychology, which is aimed at our undergraduate and postgraduate students to teach them about certain important psychological principles that might matter when thinking about designing digital technologies. I also collaborate with the UK Information Commissioner's Office on this module. So recently we collaborated on the newly launched Age Appropriate Design Code, where we've tested some of the ideas from the code with our students. And the work is being done to collect and build a case study for why it is important that we consider age and development when designing the future technologies. Now, at design engineering, human-centric design is a key focus and is taught to our students. And I believe that this is absolutely crucial if we're going to thrive as a species. So there's a lot of focus on poorly designed technologies out there, and I'm sure we could all think of some of those, particularly when we think of children and young people using them. Many parents are concerned about their children's exposure to smart technologies, for instance. It's also important to note that I believe that most technologies are designed for the benefit of people in the first instance. I don't think innovators aim to create technologies that will contribute to poor mental or physical health of their users. However, I do think it is partially the lack of insight, sometimes lack of interest, but mainly lack of insight into long-term consequences of technologies for people's mental well-being that can create these problems. It also doesn't help that continuous technological innovation is very much contingent on profitability, and that sort of becomes the guiding principle. But there are glimmers of hope out there. For example, Super Awesome is a company that helps to create safe digital media ecosystems for children and young people by providing tools for safe digital engagement. I'm seeing more and more of this happening, particularly aimed at children and young people. Upcoming financial services that aim to teach children how to spend money is another great example. Go Henry is a company um, that is one of the, in my view, important actors in this area. This is starting to pop up and become increasingly available. Now, it's important to note that all these technologies are new and they have a while to go, but I believe that certainly they are created with children and young people in mind, and they focus very distinctively on well-being. Now, I think we can all agree that it's important to attack this problem from multiple points. But I'm going to play the devil's advocate somewhat and deviate slightly from this. Because as much as I believe in the power of personal responsibility and improved education, not to mention a stronger focus on digital literacy, these are all crucial in helping to combat the issue. I do think that we are in trouble because of how these technologies are designed. If we want to stop people from um, falling prey to misuse of their personal data, we actually have to design this directly into the technologies. Right now, the system is geared towards leaving us very vulnerable and unprotected. Uh, Oftentimes, we place too much emphasis on things like personal autonomy to make various decisions. But the truth is that many of us really don't have much autonomy in what kind of technologies we can use. We use software and technologies that are available to us through our employers, through our schools and education, through our friends. We want to stay in touch with our friends. We don't want to be left out. And so, in a way, oftentimes we're forced to use what's already available and out there, and what's out there isn't necessarily made to be privacy preserving. And this is a huge problem. So instead of blaming individuals and saying that it's our fault that we're not preserving our own privacy, and making assumptions that everyone understands how their digital privacy is violated, I do believe that we need to have very, very strong legislation that stops people being exploited like this in the first place. And I do also believe that it is largely due to companies and technological innovators to ensure that these technologies work well to begin with. The assumption cannot be that technologies are created to be privacy intrusive. The assumption should be that technology should be protective, and of course, we should educate people and we should ensure that children understand concepts such as privacy and cookies and how to use the internet safely, etc. But we have to make sure that this cannot legally continue happening right under our very noses. So, again, just to reiterate, I do believe that it's important that we take our own responsibility and we educate ourselves and our children against how our privacy might be breached. But it's not always, it's far from always our own fault when it does happen. I will take the side of the average user of these products. Let us be mindful that the technologies in question, such as social networking platforms or smartphones, they are created in such a clever way so as to pull our attention all the time. It is very, very difficult for someone, and it requires quite a bit of impulse control not to be sucked into using these technologies continuously. They are designed to trigger our reward, our dopamine system. It makes us feel good. They include many kind of validating aspects that make us feel like we can't live without them. We need to be part of them. There are social pressures to be connected, and these are particularly pertinent for young people. So I do think that we are fighting a very difficult battle because these technologies are designed to make sure that we're hooked. And that helps to explain why their popularity is continuously growing. Um, I think the only way out of this is to really change the current business model, which focuses on uh, our attention and our data being harvested away from us. I think where we need to go is to be in control of this. And the one way to do that, and there are arguments for and against it, but one way to do that is to ensure that we can pay for these services and therefore have a bigger say in how our data and how is used and how our attention is pulled. I think this is a fantastic initiative. I wish it was done more like this. Um, in the world that we live right now, where we're all, most of us anyway, working from home and thinking about these things, there's nothing to stop us to create this type of content and make it readily available. But it can be difficult to do so on your own. And this is such a fantastic idea to collect a number of different viewpoints by a number of different stakeholders and put them all together as a resource that's available out there. So I hope that this continues and that you can maybe make the project into a recurring event. That would be fantastic to see. And I hope that other organizations pick this up as a working model as well. Thank you.